My Lords and Gentlemen, by Jonathan Swift. I have now communicated to you not only the terms of peace, which may, by the future treaty, be obtained for my own subjects, but likewise the proposals of France for satisfying our allies. The former are such as I have reason to expect, to make my people some amends for that great and unequal burden which they have lain under through the whole course of this war, and I am willing to hope that none of our confederates, and especially those to whom so great accessions of dominion and power are to accrue by this peace, will envy Britain her share in the glory and advantage of it. The latter are not yet so perfectly adjusted as a little more time might have rendered them, but the season of the year making it necessary to put an end to this session, I resolved no longer to defer communicating these matters to you. I can make no doubt, but you are all fully persuaded, that nothing will be neglected on my part in the progress of this negotiation to bring the peace to an happy and speedy issue, and I depend on your entire confidence in me and your cheerful concurrence with me. The discontented party in the House of Commons, finding the torrent against them not to be stemmed, suspended their opposition, by which means an address was voted, nem contradicent, to acknowledge Her Majesty's condescension, to express their satisfaction in what she had already done, and to desire she would please to proceed with the present negotiations for obtaining a speedy peace. During these transactions at home, the Duke of Ormond VIII was in a very uneasy situation at the army, employed in practicing those arts which perhaps are fitter for a subtle negotiator than a great commander. But as he had always proved his obedience, where courage or conduct could be of use, so the duty he professed to his prince made him submit to continue in a state of inactivity at the head of his troops, however contrary to his nature, if it were for Her Majesty's service. He had sent early notice to the ministers that he could not depend upon the foreign forces in the Queen's pay, and he now found some attempts were already begun to seduce them. While the courier was expected from Madrid, the Duke had orders to inform the Marechal de Villars of the true state of this affair, and that his Grace would have decisive orders in 3 or 4 days. In the meantime, he desired the Marechal would not oblige him to come to any action either to defend himself or to join with Prince Eugene's army, which he must necessarily do if the prince were attacked. When the courier was arrived with the account that Philip had chosen to accept of Spain, Her Majesty had proposed to France a suspension of arms for 2 months, to be prolonged to 3 or 4, between the armies now in Flanders, upon the following conditions: that during the suspension, endeavors should be used for concluding a general peace, or at least the article for preventing the union of France and Spain should be punctually executed by Philip's renouncing France for himself and his posterity, and the princes of Bourbon, in like manner, renouncing Spain, and that the town, citadel, and forts of Dunkirk should be immediately delivered into the Queen's hands. Her Majesty at the same time endeavored to get Cambrai for the Dutch, provided they would come into the suspension. But this was absolutely rejected by France, which that court would never have ventured to do if those allies could have been prevailed on to have acted with sincerity and openness in concert with Her Majesty, as her plenipotentiaries had always desired. However, the Queen promised that if the states would yield to a suspension of arms, they should have some valuable pledge put into their possession. But now fresh intelligence daily arrived, both from Utrecht and the army, of attempts to make the troops in Her Majesty's pay desert her service, and a design even of seizing the British forces was whispered about and with reason suspected. When the Queen's speech was published in Holland, the Lord Privy Seal told the Dutch ministers at Utrecht that what Her Majesty had laid before her Parliament could not, according to the rules of treaty, be looked on as the utmost of what France would yield in the course of a negotiation, but only the utmost of what that crown would propose in order to form the plan of a peace, that these conditions would certainly have been better if the states had thought fit to have gone hand in hand with Her Majesty, as she had so frequently exhorted them to do, that nothing but the want of harmony among the allies had spirited the French to stand out so long, that the Queen would do them all the good offices in her power if they thought fit to comply, and did not doubt of getting them reasonable satisfaction, both in relation to their barrier and their trade. But this reasoning made no impression, The Dutch ministers said the Queen's speech had deprived them of the fruits of the war. They were in pain, lest Lille and Tournai might be two of the towns to be accepted out of their barrier. The rest of the Allies grew angry by the example of the Dutch. The populace in Holland began to be inflamed. They publicly talked that Britain had betrayed them. Sermons were preached in several towns of their provinces, whether by direction or connivance, filled with the highest instances of disrespect to Her Britannic Majesty, whom they charged as a papist and an enemy to their country. The Lord Privy Seal himself believed something extraordinary was in agitation, and that his own person was in danger from the fury of the people. It is certain that the States appeared but a few days before very much disposed to comply with the measures the Queen had taken, and would have consented to a general armistice if Count Zinzendorf, one of the plenipotentiaries for the Emperor, had not, by direct orders from his court, employed himself in sowing jealousies between Britain and the States, and at the same time made prodigious offers to the latter, as well as to the ministers of Prussia, the Palatinate, and Hanover, for continuing the war. That those three electors, who contributed nothing, except bodies of men in return of pay and subsidies, should readily accept the proposals of the Emperor, is easy to be accounted for. What appears hardly credible is that a grave republic, usually cautious enough in making their bargains, should venture to reject the thoughts of a peace upon the promises of the House of Austria, the little validity whereof they had so long experienced, and especially when they counted upon losing the support of Britain, their most powerful ally. But the false hopes given them by their friends in England of some new change in their favor, or an imagination of bringing France to better terms by the appearance of resolution, added to the weakness or corruption of some who administered their affairs, were the true causes which first created, and afterwards inflamed, this untractable temper among them. The Dutch ministers were wholly disconcerted and surprised when the Lord Privy Seal told them that a suspension of arms in the Netherlands would be necessary, and that the Duke of Ormond intended very soon to declare it after he had taken possession of Dunkirk. But his lordship endeavored to convince them that this incident ought rather to be a motive for hastening the States into a compliance with Her Majesty. He likewise communicated to the ministers of the Allies the offers made by France, as delivered in the speech from the throne, which Her Majesty thought to be satisfactory, and hoped their masters would concur with her in bringing the peace to a speedy conclusion, wherein each, in particular, might be assured of her best offices for advancing their just pretensions. In the meantime, the Duke of Ormond was directed to send a body of troops to take possession of Dunkirk, as soon as he should have notice from the Marechal de Villers that the commandant of the town had received orders from his court to deliver it. But the Duke foresaw many difficulties in the executing of this commission. He could trust such an enterprise to no forces except those of Her Majesty's own subjects. He considered the temper of the States in this conjuncture, and was loth to divide a small body of men upon whose faithfulness alone he could depend. He thought it not prudent to expose them to march through the enemy's country, with whom there was yet neither peace nor truce, and he had sufficient reasons to apprehend that the Dutch would either not permit such a detachment to pass through their towns, as themselves had more than hinted to him, or would seize them as they passed. Besides, the Duke had very fairly signified to Marechal de Villers that he expected to be deserted by all the foreign troops in Her Majesty's pay as soon as the armistice should be declared, at which the Marechal, appearing extremely disappointed, said, the King his master reckoned that all the troops under his Grace's command should yield to the cessation, and wondered how it should come to pass that those who might be paid for lying still would rather choose, after a 10 years' war, to enter into the service of new masters, under whom they must fight on for nothing. In short, the opinion of Mons. Villers was that this difficulty cancelled the promise of surrendering Dunkirk, which therefore he opposed as much as possible in the letters he writ to his court. Upon the Duke of Ormond's representing those difficulties, the Queen altered her measures and ordered forces to be sent from England to take possession of Dunkirk. The Duke was likewise commanded to tell the foreign generals in Her Majesty's service how highly she would resent their desertion, after which their masters must give up all thoughts of any arrears, either of pay or subsidy. the Lord Privy Seal spoke the same language at Utrecht to the several ministers of the Allies, as Mr. Secretary St. John did to those who resided here, adding that the proceeding of the foreign troops would be looked upon as a declaration for or against Her Majesty, and that, in case they desert her service, she would look on herself as justified before God and man to continue her negotiation at Utrecht or any other place, whether the Allies concur or not. And particularly the Dutch were assured that if their masters seduced the forces hired by the Queen, they must take the whole pay, arrears, and subsidies on themselves. 10. Footnote 10. Compare this language of Bishop Robinson with the letter Bolingbroke had previously written to Thomas Harley, letter of May 17, 1712. On the report which my Lord Strafford, who arrived here the day before yesterday, has made by word of mouth, as well as upon the contents of the latter dispatches from Utrecht, Her Majesty is fully determined to let all negotiations sleep in Holland, since they have neither sense, nor gratitude, nor spirit enough to make a suitable return to the offers lately sent by the Queen, and communicated by the plenipotentiaries. Her Majesty will look on herself as under no obligation towards them, but proceed to make the peace either with or without them. When the States General addressed a complaint to the Queen of the manner in which England was deserting them, Bolingbroke had their letter formally condemned by a resolution of the House of Commons. He was determined to bring this peace about, and the Dutch might kick and flounce like wild beasts caught in a toil, yet the cords are too strong for them to break. Report from the Committee of Secrecy, T.S. The Earl of Strafford, preparing about this time to return to Utrecht, with instructions proper to the present situation of affairs, went first to the army, and there informed the Duke of Ormond of Her Majesty's intentions. He also acquainted the States Deputies with the Queen's uneasiness, lest, by the measures they were taking, they should drive her to extremities, which she desired so much to avoid. He farther represented to them, in the plainest terms, the provocations Her Majesty had received, and the grounds and reasons for her present conduct. He likewise declared to the commanders-in-chief of the foreign troops, in the Queen's pay, and in the joint pay of Britain and the States, with how much surprise Her Majesty had heard, that there was the least doubt of their obeying the orders of the Duke of Ormond, which if they refused, Her Majesty would esteem it not only as an indignity and affront, but as a declaration against her, and in such a case, they must look on themselves as no farther entitled either to any arrear or future pay or subsidies. 6 regiments, under the command of Mr. Hill 11, were now preparing to embark, in order to take possession of Dunkirk, and the Duke of Ormond, upon the first intelligence sent him that the French were ready to deliver the town, was to declare he could act no longer against France. The Queen gave notice immediately of her proceedings to the States. She let them plainly know that their perpetual caballing with her factious subjects against her authority had forced her into such measures as otherwise she would not have engaged in. However, Her Majesty was willing yet to forget all that had passed, and to unite with them in the strictest ties of amity, which she hoped they would now do, since they could not but be convinced, by the late dutiful addresses of both houses, how far their high mightinesses had been deluded, and drawn in as instruments to serve the turn, and gratify the passions of a disaffected party, that their opposition and want of concert with Her Majesty's ministers, which she had so often invited them to, had encouraged France to accept towns out of their barrier, which otherwise might have been yielded, that however she had not precluded them, or any other ally, from demanding more, and even her own terms were but conditional upon supposition of a general peace to ensue, that Her Majesty resolved to act upon the plan laid down in her speech, and she repeated the promise of her best offices to promote the interest of the States, if they would deal sincerely with her. Some days before the Duke of Ormond had notice that orders were given for the surrender of Dunkirk, Prince Eugene of Savoy sent for the generals of the Allies and asked them severally whether, in case the armies separated, they would march with him or stay with the Duke. All of them, except 2, who commanded but small bodies, agreed to join with the Prince, who thereupon, about 3 days after, sent the Duke word that he intended to march the following day, as it was supposed, to besiege Landrecies. The Duke returned an answer that he was surprised at the Prince's message, there having been not the least previous concert with him, nor any mention in the message which way, or upon what design, the march was intended. Therefore, that the Duke could not resolve to march with him, much less could the prince expect assistance from the Queen's army in any design undertaken after this manner. The Duke told this beforehand, that he, the prince, might take his measures accordingly and not attribute to Her Majesty's general any misfortune that might happen. On the 16th of July, the several generals of the Allies joined Prince Eugene's army and began their march, after taking leave of the Duke and the Earl of Strafford, whose expostulations could not prevail on them to stay, although the latter assured them that the Queen had made neither peace nor truce with France, and that her forces would now be left exposed to the enemy. The next day after this famous desertion, the Duke of Ormond received a letter from Mons de Villers with an account that the town and citadel of Dunkirk should be delivered to Mr. Hill, whereupon a cessation of arms was declared by sound of trumpet at the head of the British army, which now consisted only of about 18,000 men, all of Her Majesty's subjects, except the Holsteiners and Count Wallis's dragoons. With this small body of men, the general began his march, and pursuant to orders from court, retired towards the sea, in the manner he thought most convenient for the Queen's service. When he came as far as Flines, he was told by some of his officers that the commandants of Bouchain, Douai, Lille, and Tournai had refused them passage through those towns, or even liberty of entrance, and said it was by order of their masters. 13. The Duke immediately recollected that when the deputies first heard of his resolution to withdraw his troops, they told him they hoped he did not intend to march through any of their towns. This made him conclude that the orders must be general, and that his army would certainly meet with the same treatment which his officers had done. He had likewise, before the armies separated, received information of some designs that concerned the safety, or at least the freedom of his own person, and which he much more valued, that of those few British troops entrusted to his care. No general was ever more truly or deservedly beloved by his soldiers, who to a man were prepared to sacrifice their lives in his service, and whose resentments were raised to the utmost by the ingratitude, as they termed it, of their deserters. Upon these provocations, he laid aside all thoughts of returning to Dunkirk, and began to consider how he might perform, in so difficult a conjuncture, something important to the Queen, and at the same time find a secure retreat for his forces. He formed his plan without communicating it to any person whatsoever, and the disposition of the army being to march towards Warneton in the way to Dunkirk, he gave sudden orders to Lieutenant General Cadogan to change his route, according to the military phrase, and move towards Orchies, a town leading directly to Ghent. When Prince Eugene and the States deputies received news of the Duke's motions, they were alarmed to the utmost degree, and sent Count Nassau of Woudenberg to the general's camp near Orchies, to excuse what had been done, and to assure his grace that those commandants who had refused passage to his officers had acted wholly without orders. Count Hompesch, one of the Dutch generals, came likewise to the Duke with the same story, but all this made little impression on the general, who held on his march, and on the 23rd of July, NS entered Ghent, where he was received with great submission by the inhabitants, and took possession of the town, as he likewise did of Bruges a few days after. The Duke of Ormond thought that, considering the present disposition of the States towards Britain, it might be necessary for the Queen to have some pledge from that republic in her hands, as well as from France, by which means Her Majesty would be empowered to act the part that best became her, of being mediator at least, and that while Ghent was in the Queen's hands, no provisions could pass the Scheldt or the Lys without her permission, by which he had it in his power to starve their army. The possession of these towns might likewise teach the Dutch and Imperialists to preserve a degree of decency and civility to Her Majesty, which both of them were upon some occasions too apt to forget. And besides, there was already in the town of Ghent a battalion of British troops and a detachment of 500 men in the citadel, together with a great quantity of ammunition stores for the service of the war, which would certainly have been seized or embezzled, so that no service could be more seasonable or useful in the present juncture than this, which the Queen highly approved, and left the Duke a discretionary power to act as he thought fit on any future emergency. I have a little interrupted the order of time in relating the Duke of Ormond's proceedings, who, after having placed a garrison at Bruges and sent a supply of men and ammunition to Dunkirk, retired to Ghent, where he continued some months, till he had leave to return to England. Upon the arrival of Colonel Disney 14 at court, with an account that Mr. Hill had taken possession of Dunkirk, and universal joy spread over the kingdom, this event being looked on as the certain forerunner of a peace. Besides, the French faith was in so ill a reputation among us that many persons, otherwise sanguine enough, could never bring themselves to believe that the town would be delivered till certain intelligence came that it was actually in our hands. Neither were the ministers themselves altogether at ease or free from suspicion, whatever countenance they made, for they knew very well that the French king had many plausible reasons to elude his promise if he found cause to repent it. One condition of surrendering Dunkirk being a general armistice of all the troops in the British pay, which Her Majesty was not able to perform, and upon this failure the Marechal de Villars, as we have before related, endeavoured to dissuade his court from accepting the conditions, and in the very interval, while those difficulties were adjusting, the Marechal d'Uxelles, one of the French plenipotentiaries at Utrecht, whose inclinations, as well as those of his colleague Mons Messenger, led him to favour the States more than Britain, assured the Lord Privy Seal that the Dutch were then pressing to enter into separate measures with his master, and his lordship, in a visit to the Abbé de Polignac, observing a person to withdraw as he entered the abbé's chamber, was told by this minister that the person he saw was one Molo of Amsterdam, mentioned before, a famous agent for the States with France, who had been entertaining him, the abbé, upon the same subject, but that he had refused to treat with Molo without the privity of England. Footnote 14. Colonel Disney, or Disney, called Duke Disney, was one of the members of the Brothers' Club, a boon companion of Bolingbroke, and, as Swift says, not an old man, but an old rake. From various sources, we gather that he was a high liver, and not very nice in his ways of high living. In spite, however, of his undoubted profligacy, he must have been a man of good nature and a kindly heart, since he received affectionate record from Gay, Pope, and Swift. Mr. Walter Sichel quotes from an unfinished sketch of a larger poem by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, in which Disney's worst characteristics are held up to ridicule. Bolingbroke and His Times, pp. 288–90, Swift often refers to him in his journal, T.S. Mr. Harley, whom we mentioned above to have been sent early in the spring to Utrecht, continued longer in Holland than was at first expected, but having received Her Majesty's farther instructions, was about this time arrived at Hanover. It was the misfortune of His Electoral Highness to be very ill served by Mons Bothmer, his envoy here, who assisted at all the factious meetings of the discontented party, and deceived his master by a false representation of the kingdom, drawn from the opinion of those to whom he confined his conversation. There was likewise at the elector's court a little Frenchman, without any merit or consequence, called Robethon, 15, who, by the assistance and encouragement of the last ministry, had insinuated himself into some degree of that prince's favour, which he used in giving his master the worst impressions he was able of those whom the Queen employed in her service, insinuating that the present ministers were not in the interest of His Highness's family, that their views were towards the pretender, that they were making an unsecure and dishonourable peace, that the weight of the nation was against them, and that it was impossible for them to preserve much longer their credit or power. The Earl Rivers had, in the foregoing year, been sent to Hanover in order to undeceive the elector and remove whatever prejudices might be infused into His Highness against Her Majesty's proceedings, but it should seem that he had no very great success in his negotiation, for soon after his return to England, Mons Bothmer's memorial appeared in the manner I have already related, which discovered the sentiments of His Electoral Highness, if they were truly represented in that memorial, to differ not a little from those of the Queen. Mr. Harley was therefore directed to take the first opportunity of speaking to the elector in private, to assure him that although Her Majesty had thought herself justly provoked by the conduct of his minister, yet such was her affection for His Highness, and concern for the interests of his family, that instead of showing the least mark of resentment, she had chosen to send him Mr. Harley fully instructed to open her designs and show His Highness the real interest of Britain in the present conjuncture. Mr. Harley was to give the elector a true account of what had passed in England during the first part of this session of Parliament, to expose to His Highness the weakness of those with whom his minister had consulted and under whose directions he had acted, to convince him how much lower that faction must become when a peace should be concluded, and when the natural strength of the kingdom, disencumbered from the burthen of the war, should be at liberty to exert itself, to show him how his interest in the succession was sacrificed to that of a party, that His Highness had been hitherto a friend to both sides, but that the measures taken by his ministers had tended only to set him at the head of one in opposition to the other, to explain to the elector how fully the safety of Europe was provided for by the plan of peace in Her Majesty's speech, and how little reason those would appear to have who complained the loudest of this plan if it were compared either with our engagements to them when we began the war, or with their performances in the course of it. Upon this occasion Mr. Harley was to observe to the elector that it should rather be wondered at how the Queen had brought France to offer so much than yet to offer no more, because, as soon as ever it appeared that Her Majesty would be at the head of this treaty, and that the interests of Britain were to be provided for, such endeavors were used to break off the negotiation as are hardly to be paralleled, and the disunion thereby created among the Allies had given more opportunities to the enemy of being slow in their concessions than any other measures might possibly have done, that this want of concert among the Allies could not in any sort be imputed to the Queen, who had all along invited them to it with the greatest earnestness, as the surest means to bring France to reason, that she had always, in a particular manner, pressed the States General to come into the strictest union with her, and open to them her intentions with the greatest freedom. But finding that instead of concurring with Her Majesty, they were daily carrying on intrigues to break off the negotiation, and thereby deprive her of the advantages she might justly expect from the ensuing peace, having no other way left, she was forced to act with France as she did by herself. That, however, the Queen had not taken upon herself to determine the interests of the Allies, who were at liberty of insisting on farther pretensions, wherein Her Majesty would not be wanting to support them as far as she was able, and improve the concessions already made by France, in which case a good understanding and harmony among the confederates would yet be of the greatest use for making the enemy more tractable and easy. I have been more particular in reciting the substance of Mr. Harley's instructions, because it will serve as a recapitulation of what I have already said upon this subject, and seems to set Her Majesty's intentions and proceedings at this time in the clearest light. After the cessation of arms declared by the Duke of Ormond upon the delivery of Dunkirk, the British plenipotentiaries very earnestly pressed those of Holland to come into a general armistice, for if the whole Confederacy acted in conjunction, this would certainly be the best means for bringing the common enemy to reasonable terms of peace. But the States, deluded by the boundless promises of Count Zinzendorf and the undertaking talent of Prince Eugene, who dreaded the conclusion of the war as the period of his glory, would not hear of a cessation. The loss of 18,000 Britons was not a diminution of weight in the balance of such an ally as the Emperor and such a general as the Prince. Besides, they looked upon themselves to be still superior to France in the field, and although their computation was certainly right in point of number, yet, in my opinion, the conclusion drawn from it was grounded upon a great mistake. I have been assured by several persons of our own country, and some foreigners of the first rank, both for skill and station in arms, that in most victories obtained in the present war, the British troops were ever employed in the post of danger and honor, and usually began the attack, being allowed to be naturally more fearless than the people of any other country, by which they were not only an example of courage to the rest, but must be acknowledged, without partiality, to have governed the fortune of the day, since it is known enough how small a part of an army is generally engaged in any battle. It may likewise be added that nothing is of greater moment in war than opinion. The French, by their frequent losses, which they chiefly attributed to the courage of our men, believed that a British general at the head of British troops was not to be overcome, and the Marechal de Villars was quickly sensible of the advantage he had got. For in a very few days after the desertion of the Allies happened the Earl of Albemarle's disgrace at Denning, by a feint of the Marechal's, manifest failure somewhere or other, both of courage and conduct on the side of the Confederates, the blame of which was equally shared between Prince Eugene and the Earl, although it is certain the Duke of Ormond gave the latter timely warning of his danger, observing he was neither entrenched as he ought, nor provided with bridges sufficient for the situation he was in, and at such a distance from the main army 16. The Marquis de Torcy had likewise the same sentiments, of what mighty consequence those few British battalions were to the Confederate army, since he advised his master to deliver up Dunkirk, although the Queen could not perform the condition understood, which was a cessation of arms of all the foreign forces in her pay. It must be owned that Mons de Torcy made great merit of this confidence that his master placed in the Queen, and observing Her Majesty's displeasure against the Dutch, on account of their late proceedings, endeavored to inflame it with aggravations enough, insinuating that, since the States had acted so ungratefully, the Queen should let her forces join with those of France in order to compel the Confederates to a peace. But although this overture were very tenderly hinted from the French court, Her Majesty heard it with the utmost abhorrence, and ordered her secretary, Mr. St. John, created about this time Viscount Bolingbroke, 17, to tell Mons de Torcy that no provocations whatever should tempt her to distress her allies, but she would endeavor to bring them to reason by fair means, or leave them to their own conduct, that if the former should be found impracticable, she would then make her own peace, and content herself with doing the office of a mediator between both parties. But if the States should at any time come to a better mind, and suffer their ministers to act in conjunction with hers, she would assert their just interests to the utmost, and make no farther progress in any treaty with France, until those allies received all reasonable satisfaction, both as to their barrier and their trade. The British plenipotentiaries were directed to give the same assurances to the Dutch ministers at Utrecht, and withal to let them know that the Queen was determined, by their late conduct, to make peace either with or without them, but would much rather choose the former. Footnote 17. Bolingbroke had understood that he would not lose rank on his promotion, from which he concluded that the earldom of Bolingbroke, extinct in his family, would be revived in his favor. His indignation, however, was very keen when he was created only a viscount. He wrote to Strafford at Utrecht that his promotion had been a mortification to him. In the House of Commons, he said, "I may say that I was at the head of business. There was, therefore, nothing to flatter my ambition in removing me from thence, but giving me the title which had been many years in my family, and which reverted to the crown about a year ago by the death of the last of the elder house. I own to you that I felt more indignation than ever in my life I had done." Letter to the Earl of Strafford, July 23, 1712, T.S. There was, however, one advantage which Her Majesty resolved to make by this defection of her foreigners. She had been led, by the mistaken politics of some years past, to involve herself in several guarantees with the princes of the North, which were, in some sort, contradictory to one another. But this conduct of theirs wholly annulled all such engagements, and left her at liberty to interpose in the affairs of those parts of Europe, in such a manner as would best serve the interests of her own kingdoms, as well as that of the Protestant religion, and settle a due balance of power in the North. The grand article for preventing the union of France and Spain was to be executed during a cessation of arms, but many difficulties arising about that, and some other points of great importance to the common cause, which could not easily be adjusted either between the French and British plenipotentiaries at Utrecht, or by correspondence between Mons de Torcy and the ministry here, the Queen took the resolution of sending the Lord Viscount Bolingbroke immediately to France, fully instructed in all her intentions, and authorized to negotiate everything necessary for settling the treaty of peace in such a course as might bring it to a happy and speedy conclusion. He was empowered to agree to a general suspension of arms, by sea and land, between Great Britain, France, and Spain, to continue for 4 months, or until the conclusion of the peace, provided France and Spain would previously give positive assurances to make good the terms demanded by Her Majesty for the Duke of Savoy, and would likewise adjust and determine the forms of the several renunciations to be made by both those crowns, in order to prevent their being ever united. The Lord Bolingbroke, was likewise authorized to settle some differences relating to the Elector of Bavaria, for whose interests France was as much concerned as Her Majesty was for those of the Duke of Savoy, to explain all doubtful articles which particularly related to the advantages of Britain, to know the real ultimatum, as it is termed, of France upon the general plan of peace, and lastly, to cut off all hopes from that court of ever bringing the Queen to force her allies to a disadvantageous peace, Her Majesty resolving to impose no scheme at all upon them, or to debar them from the liberty of endeavoring to obtain the best conditions they could. The Lord Bolingbroke went to France in the beginning of August 18, was received at court with particular marks of distinction and respect, and in a very few days, by his usual address and ability, performed every part of his commission, extremely to the Queen's content and his own honor. He returned to England before the end of the month, but Mr. Prior, who went along with him, was left behind to adjust whatever differences might remain or arise between the two crowns. 19. Footnote 18. Lord Bolingbroke and Prior set out for France last Saturday. My lord's business is to hasten the peace before the Dutch are too much mauled, and hinder France from carrying the jest of beating them too far. Journal to Stella, August 7, 1712. See Vol. 2, p. 381 of present edition. The result of Bolingbroke's visit was the signing, on August 19, of an agreement for the suspension of arms for 4 months. Torcy's reception of Bolingbroke was so managed that the bon vivant peer had as pleasant a time as he could well have wished. How much influence that had on Bolingbroke we can only speculate, but it is certain that he would have made a separate peace with France after his return had Oxford been willing. See Torcy's Memoirs, Vol. 2, p. 202. Bolingbroke avoit conseil et la réunie sa maîtresse de préférer une paix particulière à la suspension d'armes, et d'assurer au plus tôt à ses sujets la jouissance de toutes les conditions dont le roi était convenu en faveur de l'Angleterre. T.S. In the meantime, the general conferences at Utrecht, which for several weeks had been let fall since the delivery of Dunkirk, were now resumed. But the Dutch still declaring against a suspension of arms and refusing to accept the Queen's speech as a plan to negotiate upon, there was no progress made for some time in the great work of the peace. Whereupon the British plenipotentiaries told those of the States that if the Queen's endeavors could not procure more than the contents of her speech, or if the French should ever fall short of what was there offered, the Dutch could blame none but themselves, who, by their conduct, had rendered things difficult that would otherwise have been easy. However, Her Majesty thought it prudent to keep the States still in hopes of her good offices, to prevent them from taking the desperate course of leaving themselves wholly at the mercy of France, which was an expedient they formerly practiced, and which a party among them was now inclined to advise. Whilst the Congress at Utrecht remained in this inactive state, the Queen proceeded to perfect that important article for preventing the union of France and Spain. It was proposed and accepted that Philip should renounce France for himself and his posterity, and that the most Christian king and all the princes of his blood should, in the like manner, renounce Spain. It must be confessed that this project of renunciation lay under a great disrepute by the former practices of this very king, Louis XIV, pursuant to an absurd notion among many in that kingdom of a divine right annexed to proximity of blood, not to be controlled by any human law. But it is plain the French themselves had recourse to this method after all their infractions of it since the Pyrenean Treaty, for the first Dauphin, in whom the original claim was vested, renounced for himself and his eldest son, which opened the way to Philip, Duke of Anjou, who would however hardly have succeeded if it had not been for the will made in his favor by the last king, Charles II. It is indeed hard to reflect, with any patience, upon the unaccountable stupidity of the princes of Europe for some centuries past, who left a probability to France of succeeding in a few ages to all their dominions, whilst, at the same time, no alliance with that kingdom could be of advantage to any prince, by reason of the Salic law. Should not common prudence have taught every sovereign in Christendom to enact a Salic law with respect to France, for want of which it is almost a miracle that the Bourbon family hath not possessed the universal monarchy by right of inheritance. When the French assert a proximity of blood gives a divine right, as some of their ministers, who ought to be more wise or honest, have lately advanced in this very case to the title of Spain, do they not, by allowing a French succession, make their own kings usurpers? Or if the Salic law be divine, is it not of universal obligation, and consequently of force, to exclude France from inheriting by daughters? Or lastly, if that law be of human institution, may it not be enacted in any state, with whatever extent or limitation the legislature shall think fit? For the notion of an unchangeable human law is an absurdity in government, to be believed only by ignorance and supported by power. From hence it follows that the children of the late Queen of France, although she had renounced, were as legally excluded from succeeding to Spain as if the Salic law had been fundamental in that kingdom, since that exclusion was established by every power in Spain which could possibly give a sanction to any law there, and therefore the Duke of Anjou's title is wholly founded upon the bequest of his predecessor, which hath great authority in that monarchy, as it formerly had in ours, upon the confirmation of the Cortes and the general consent of the people. It is certain, the faith of princes is so frequently subservient to their ambition, that renunciations have little validity, otherwise than from the powers and parties whose interest it is to support them. But this renunciation, which the Queen hath exacted from the French king and his grandson, I take to be armed with all the essential circumstances that can fortify such an act. For as it is necessary, for the security of every prince in Europe, that those two great kingdoms should never be united, so the chief among them will readily consent to be guarantees for preventing such a misfortune. Besides, this proposal, according to Her Majesty's expression in her speech, is of such a nature that it executes itself, because the Spaniards, who dread such an union, for every reason that can have weight among men, took care that their king should not only renounce in the most solemn manner, but likewise that the act should be framed in the strongest terms themselves could invent, or we could furnish them with. As to France, upon supposal of the young Dauphin's dying in a few years, that kingdom will not be in a condition to engage in a long war against a powerful alliance, fortified with the addition of the Spaniards, and the party of the Duke of Berry, or whoever else shall be next claimer. And the longer the present Dauphin lives, the weaker must Philip's interest be in France, because the princes, who are to succeed by this renunciation, will have most power and credit in the kingdom. The mischiefs occasioned by the want of a good understanding between the allies, especially Britain and Holland, were raised every day, the French taking the advantage and raising difficulties not only upon the general plan of peace, but likewise upon the explanation of several articles in the projected treaty between them and Her Majesty. They insisted to have Lille as the equivalent for Dunkirk, and demanded Tournai, Maubeuge, and Conde for the 2 or 3 towns mentioned in the Queen's speech, which the British plenipotentiaries were so far from allowing that they refused to confer with those of France upon that foot, although at the same time the former had fresh apprehensions that the Dutch, in a fit of despair, would accept whatever terms the enemy pleased to offer, and by precipitating their own peace, prevent Her Majesty from obtaining any advantages, both for her allies and herself. It is most certain that the repeated losses suffered by the States in little more than 2 months after they had withdrawn themselves from the Queen's assistance did wholly disconcert their councils. 20, and their prudence, as it is usual, began to forsake them with their good fortune. They were so weak as to be still deluded by their friends in England, who continued to give them hopes of some mighty and immediate resource from hence. For when the Duke of Ormond had been about a month in Ghent, he received a letter from the Marechal de Villars to inform him that the Dutch generals, taken at Denain, had told the Marechal publicly of a sudden revolution expected in Britain, that particularly the Earl of Albemarle and Mons. Hompesch discoursed very freely of it, and that nothing was more commonly talked of in Holland. It was then likewise confidently reported in Ghent that the Queen was dead, and we all remember what rumour flew about here at the very same time, as if Her Majesty's health were in a bad condition. Whether such vain hopes as these gave spirit to the Dutch, whether their frequent misfortunes made them angry and sullen, whether they still expected to overreach us by some private stipulations with France, through the mediation of the Elector of Bavaria, as that prince afterwards gave out, or whatever else was the cause, they utterly refused a cessation of arms, and made not the least return to all the advances and invitations made by Her Majesty until the close of the campaign. It was then the states first began to view their affairs in another light, to consider how little the vast promises of Count Zinzendorf were to be relied on, to be convinced that France was not disposed to break with Her Majesty only to gratify their ill humor or unreasonable demands, to discover that their factious correspondence on this side the water had shamefully misled them, that some of their own principal towns grew heartily weary of the war and backward in their loans, and lastly, that Prince Eugene, their new general, whether his genius or fortune had left him, was not for their turn. They therefore directed their ministers at Utrecht to signify to the Lord Privy Seal and the Earl of Strafford that the states were disposed to comply with Her Majesty and to desire her good offices with France, particularly that Tournay and Conde might be left to them as part of their barrier, without which they could not be safe, that the Elector of Bavaria might not be suffered to retain any town in the Netherlands, which would be as bad for Holland as if those places were in the hands of France. Therefore the states proposed that Luxembourg, Namur, Charleroi and Nieuport might be delivered to the emperor. Lastly, that the French might not insist on accepting the 4 species of goods out of the tariff of 1,664, that if Her Majesty could prevail with France to satisfy their masters on these articles, they would be ready to submit in all the rest. When the Queen received an account of this good disposition in the States General, immediately orders were sent to Mr. Prior to inform the ministers of the French court that Her Majesty had now some hopes of the Dutch complying with her measures, and therefore she resolved, as she had always declared, whenever those allies came to themselves, not to make the peace without their reasonable satisfaction. The difficulty that most pressed was about the disposal of Tournay and Conde. The Dutch insisted strongly to have both, and the French were extremely unwilling to part with either. The Queen judged the former would suffice for completing the barrier of the states. Mr. Prior was therefore directed to press the Marquis de Torcy effectually on this head, and to terminate all that minister's objections, by assuring him of Her Majesty's resolutions to appear openly on the side of the Dutch, if this demand were refused. It was thought convenient to act in this resolute manner with France, whose late success against Holland had taught the ministers of the most Christian king to resume their old imperious manner of treating with that republic, to which they were farther encouraged by the ill understanding between Her Majesty and the Allies. This appeared from the result of an idle quarrel that happened about the end of August 21 at Utrecht between a French and a Dutch plenipotentiary, Mons. Messenger and Count Richteren, 22, wherein the court of France demanded such abject submissions, and with so much haughtiness as plainly showed they were pleased with any occasion of mortifying the Dutch. Footnote 21, July, S. Footnote 22, see note on p95, ts. Besides, the politics of the French ran at this time very opposite to those of Britain. They thought the ministers here durst not meet the Parliament without a peace, and that, therefore, Her Majesty would either force the states to comply with France by delivering up Tournay, which was the principal point in dispute, or would finish her own peace with France and Spain, leaving a fixed time for Holland to refuse or accept the terms imposed on them. But the Queen, who thought the demand of Tournay by the states to be very necessary and just, was determined to insist upon it and to declare openly against France, rather than suffer her ally to want a place so useful for their barrier. And Mr. Prior was ordered to signify this resolution of Her Majesty to Mons. De Torcy, in case that minister could not be otherwise prevailed on. The British plenipotentiaries did likewise, at the same time, express to those of Holland Her Majesty's great satisfaction that the states were at last disposed to act in confidence with her, that she wished this resolution had been sooner taken, since nobody had gained by the delay but the French king, that, however, Her Majesty did not question the procuring a safe and honorable peace by united counsels, reasonable demands, and prudent measures, that she would assist them in getting whatever was necessary to their barrier, and in settling, to their satisfaction, the exceptions made by France out of the tariff of 1,664, that no other difficulties remained of moment to retard the peace, since the Queen had obtained Sicily for the Duke of Savoy, and, in the settlement of the Low Countries, would adhere to what she delivered from the throne. That as to the empire, Her Majesty heartily wished their barrier as good as could be desired, but that we were not now in circumstances to expect everything exactly according to the scheme of Holland. France had already offered a great part, and the Queen did not think the remainder worth the continuance of the war. Her Majesty conceived the peace in so much forwardness that she thought fit, about this time, to nominate the Duke of Hamilton and the Lord Lexington for ambassadors in France and Spain, to receive the renunciations in both courts and adjust matters of commerce. The Duke 23 was preparing for his journey, when he was challenged to a duel 24 by the Lord Mohun, 25, a person of infamous character. He killed his adversary upon the spot, though he himself received a wound, and weakened by the loss of blood, as he was leaning in the arms of his second, was most barbarously stabbed in the breast by Lieutenant General Macartney, 26, who was second to Lord Mohun. He died a few minutes after in the field, and the murderer made his escape. I thought so surprising an event might deserve barely to be related, although it be something foreign to my subject. The Earl of Strafford, who had come to England in May last 27 in order to give Her Majesty an account of the disposition of affairs in Holland, was now returning with her last instructions to let the Dutch minister know that some points would probably meet with difficulties not to be overcome, which once might have been easily obtained, to show what evil consequences had already flowed from their delay and irresolution, and to entreat them to fix on some proposition, reasonable in itself as well as possible to be effected, that the Queen would insist upon the cession of Tournai by France, provided the States would concur in finishing the peace, without starting new objections or insisting upon farther points, that the French demands in favor of the Elector of Bavaria appeared to be such as the Queen was of opinion the States ought to agree to, which were to leave the Elector in possession of Luxembourg, Namur, and Charleroi, subject to the terms of their barrier until he should be restored to his electorate, and to give him the kingdom of Sardinia to efface the stain of his degradation in the Electoral College, that the Earl had brought over a project of a new treaty of succession and barrier, which Her Majesty insisted the States should sign before the conclusion of the peace, the former treaty having been disadvantageous to her subjects, containing in it the seeds of future dissensions, and condemned by the sense of the nation. Lastly, that Her Majesty, notwithstanding all provocations, had, for the sake of the Dutch, and in hopes of their recovery from those false notions which had so long misled them, hitherto kept the negotiations open, that the offers now made them were her last, and this the last time she would apply to them, that they must either agree or expect the Queen would proceed immediately to conclude her treaty with France and Spain, in conjunction with such of her allies as would think fit to adhere to her. As to Savoy, that the Queen expected the States would concur with her in making good the advantages stipulated for that Duke, and in prevailing with the Emperor to consent to an absolute neutrality in Italy until the peace should be concluded. The governing party in Holland, however in appearance disposed to finish, affected new delays and raised many difficulties about the 4 species of goods, which the French had accepted out of the tariff. Count Zinzendorf, the Emperor's plenipotentiary, did all that was possible to keep up this humor in the Dutch, in hopes to put them under a necessity of preparing for the next campaign, and some time after went so far in this pursuit that he summoned the several ministers of the empire, and told them he had letters from his master with orders to signify to them that his Imperial Majesty resolved to begin the campaign early, with all his forces united against France, of which he desired they would send notice to all their courts, that the several princes might be ready to furnish their contingents and recruits. At the same time, Zinzendorf endeavored to borrow 2 millions of florins upon the security of some imperial cities, but could not succeed either amongst the Jews or at Amsterdam. When the Earl of Strafford arrived at Utrecht, the Lord Privy Seal, and he communicated to the Dutch ministers the new treaty for a succession and barrier, as the Queen had ordered it to be prepared here in England, differing from the former in several points of the greatest moment, obvious to any who will be at the pains to compare them. This was strenuously opposed for several weeks by the plenipotentiaries of the States, but the province of Utrecht, where the Congress was held, immediately sent orders to their representatives at The Hague to declare their province thankful to the Queen that they agreed the peace should be made on the terms proposed by France and consented to the new projected Treaty of Barrier and Succession. And about the close of the year 1712, 4 of the 7 provinces had delivered their opinions for putting an end to the war. This unusual precipitation in the States, so different from the whole tenor of their former conduct, was very much suspected by the British plenipotentiaries. Their lordships had received intelligence that the Dutch ministers held frequent conferences with those of France and had offered to settle their interests with that crown without the concurrence of Britain. Count Zinzendorf and his colleagues appeared likewise, all on the sudden, to have the same dispositions and to be in great haste to settle their several differences with the States. The reasons for this proceeding were visible enough. Many difficulties were yet undetermined in the Treaty of Commerce between Her Majesty and France, for the adjusting of which, and some other points, the Queen had lately dispatched the Duke of Shrewsbury to that court. Some of these were of hard digestion, with which the most Christian king would not be under a necessity of complying when he had no farther occasion for us, and might, upon that account, afford better terms to the other 2 powers. Besides, the Emperor and the States could very well spare Her Majesty the honor of being arbitrator of a general peace, and the latter hoped by this means to avoid the new Treaty of Barrier and Succession, which we were now forcing on them. To prevent the consequences of this evil, there fortunately fell out an incident, which the 2 lords at Utrecht knew well how to make use of, the quarrel between Mons. Messenger and Count Richteren, formerly mentioned, had not yet been made up. The French and Dutch differing in some circumstances about the satisfaction to be given by the Count for the affront he had offered, the British plenipotentiaries kept this dispute on foot for several days, and in the meantime pressed the Dutch to finish the new Treaty of Barrier and Succession between Her Majesty and them, which, about the middle of January, was concluded fully to the Queen's satisfaction. But while these debates and differences continued at the Congress, the Queen resolved to put a speedy end to her part in the war. She therefore sent orders to the Lord Privy Seal and the Earl of Stafford to prepare everything necessary for signing her own treaty with France. This she hoped might be done against the meeting of her Parliament, now prorogued to the 3rd of February, in which time those among the Allies who were really inclined towards a peace might settle their several interests by the assistance and support of Her Majesty's plenipotentiaries, and as for the rest, who would either refuse to comply or endeavor to protract the negotiation, the heads of their respective demands, which France had yielded by Her Majesty's intervention, and agreeable to the plan laid down in her speech, should be mentioned in the treaty, and a time limited for the several powers concerned to receive or reject them. The Pretender was not yet gone out of France, upon some difficulties alleged by the French about procuring him a safe conduct to Bar-le-Duc in the Duke of Lorraine's dominions, where it was then proposed he should reside. The Queen, altogether bent upon quieting the minds of her subjects, declared she would not sign the peace till that person were removed, although several wise men believed he could be nowhere less dangerous to Britain than in the place where he was. The argument which most prevailed on the States to sign the new Treaty of Barrier and Succession with Britain was Her Majesty's promise to procure Tournay for them from France, after which no more differences remained between us and that republic, and consequently they had no farther temptations to any separate transactions with the French, who thereupon began to renew their litigious and haughty manner of treating with the Dutch, the satisfaction they extorted for the affront given by Count Richteren to Mons. Messenger, although somewhat softened by the British ministers at Utrecht, was yet so rigorous that Her Majesty could not forbear signifying her resentment of it to the most Christian king, Mons. Messenger, who seemed to have more the genius of a merchant than a minister, began, in his conferences with the plenipotentiaries of the States, to raise new disputes upon points which both we and they had reckoned upon as wholly settled. The Abbé de Polignac, a most accomplished person of great generosity and universal understanding, was gone to France to receive the cardinal's cap, and the Marechal d'Uxelles was wholly guided by his colleague Mons. Messenger, who kept up those brangles that for a time obstructed the peace, some of which were against all justice and others of small importance, both of very little advantage to his country and less to the reputation of his master or himself. This low talent in business, which the Cardinal de Polignac used in contempt to call a spirit of negotiating, made it impossible for the two lords plenipotentiaries, with all their abilities and experience, to bring Messenger to reason in several points both with us and the States. His concessions were few and constrained, serving only to render him more tenacious of what he refused. In several of the towns, which the States were to keep, he insisted that France should retain the châtellenies or extent of country depending on them, particularly that of Tournai, a demand the more unjustifiable because he knew his master had not only proceeded directly contrary, but had erected a court in his kingdom, where his own judges extended the territories about those towns he had taken, as far as he pleased to direct them. Mons. Messenger showed equal obstinacy in what his master expected for the Elector of Bavaria and in refusing the tariff of 1,664, so that the Queen's plenipotentiaries represented these difficulties as what might be of dangerous consequence, both to the peace in general and to the States in particular, if they were not speedily prevented. Upon these considerations, Her Majesty thought it her shortest and safest course to apply directly to France, where she had then so able a minister as the Duke of Shrewsbury. 28. The Marquis de Torcy, secretary to the Most Christian King, was the minister with whom the Duke was to treat, as having been the first who moved his master to apply to the Queen for a peace, in opposition to a violent faction in that kingdom, who were as eagerly bent to continue the war as any other could be either here or in Holland. It would be very unlike a historian to refuse this great minister the praise he so justly deserveth, of having treated, through the whole course of so great a negotiation, with the utmost candor and integrity, never once failing in any promise he made, and tempering a firm zeal to his master's interest, with a ready compliance to what was reasonable and just. Mr. Prior, whom I have formerly mentioned, resided likewise now at Paris, with the character of minister plenipotentiary, and was very acceptable to that court, upon the score of his wit and humor. 29. The Duke of Shrewsbury was directed to press the French court upon the points yet unsettled in the treaty of commerce between both crowns, to make them drop their unreasonable demands for the Elector of Bavaria, to let them know that the Queen was resolved not to forsake her allies who were now ready to come in, that she thought the best way of hastening the general peace was to determine her own particular one with France, until which time she could not conveniently suffer her Parliament to meet. The States were, by this time, so fully convinced of the Queen's sincerity and affection to their republic, and how much they had been deceived by the insinuations of the factious party in England, that they wrote a very humble letter to Her Majesty, to desire her assistance towards settling those points they had in dispute with France, and professing themselves ready to acquiesce in whatever explanation Her Majesty would please to make of the plan proposed in her speech to the Parliament. But the Queen had already prevented their desires, and in the beginning of February 1712-13 directed the Duke of Shrewsbury to inform the French court that since she had prevailed on her allies, the Dutch, to drop the demand of Condé and the other of the four species of goods which the French had accepted out of the tariff of 1,664, she would not sign without them, that she approved of the Dutch insisting to have the châtellenies restored with the towns, and was resolved to stand or fall with them until they were satisfied in this point. Her Majesty had some apprehensions that the French created these difficulties on purpose to spin out the treaty until the campaign should begin. They thought it absolutely necessary that our Parliament should meet in a few weeks, which could not well be ventured until the Queen were able to tell both houses that her own peace was signed, that this would not only facilitate what remained in difference between Britain and France, but leave the Dutch entirely at the mercy of the latter. The Queen, weary of these refined mistakes in the French politics, and fully resolved to be trifled with no longer, sent her determinate orders to the Duke of Shrewsbury to let France know that Her Majesty had hitherto prorogued her Parliament, in hopes of accommodating the difficulties in her own treaties of peace and commerce with that crown, as well as settling the interests of her several allies, or, at least, that the differences in the former being removed, the most Christian king would have made such offers for the latter as might justify Her Majesty in signing her own peace, whether the Confederates intended to sign theirs or no. But several points being yet unfinished between both crowns, and others between France and the rest of the Allies, especially the States, to which the plenipotentiaries of that court at Utrecht had not thought fit to give satisfaction, the Queen was now come to a final determination, both with relation to her own kingdoms and to the whole alliance, that the campaign approaching, she would not willingly be surprised in case the war was to go on, that she had transmitted to the Duke of Shrewsbury her last resolutions, and never would be prevailed on to reduce her own demands or those of her allies any lower than the scheme now sent over, as an explanation of the plan laid down in her speech, that Her Majesty had sent orders to her plenipotentiaries at Utrecht to assume the character of ambassadors and sign the peace immediately with the ministers of the most Christian king, as soon as the Duke of Shrewsbury should have sent them notice that the French had complied, that the Queen had therefore farther prorogued her Parliament to the 3rd of March, in hopes to assure them, by that time, of her peace being agreed on, for if the two houses should meet, while any uncertainty remained, supplies must be asked as for a war. The Duke of Shrewsbury 30 executed this important commission with that speed and success, which could only be expected from an able minister. The French king immediately yielded to the whole scheme Her Majesty proposed, whereupon directions were sent to the Lord Privy Seal and the Earl of Strafford to sign a peace between Great Britain and France without delay. Upon the 2nd day of March, the two British plenipotentiaries met those of the Allies in the town house at Utrecht, where the Lord Privy Seal addressed himself to them in a short speech, that the negotiation had now continued 14 months with great slowness, which had proved very injurious to the interests of the Allies, that the Queen had stayed thus long and stopped the finishing of her own peace, rather than leave her allies in any uncertainty, that she hoped they would now be all prepared to put an end to this great work, and therefore had commanded her plenipotentiaries to tell those of the Allies that she found it necessary to conclude her own treaty immediately, and it was her opinion that the Confederates ought to finish theirs at the same time, to which they were now accordingly invited by Her Majesty's orders. And lastly, his lordship declared in the Queen's name that whoever could not be ready on the day prefixed should have a convenient time allowed them to come in. Although the orders sent by the Queen to her plenipotentiaries were very precise, yet their lordships did not precipitate the performance of them. They were directed to appoint as short a day for the signing as they conveniently could, but however, the particular day was left to their discretion. They hoped to bring over the Dutch and most of the other allies to conclude at the same time with the Queen, which, as it would certainly be more popular to their country, so they conceived it would be more safe for themselves. Besides, upon looking over their commission, a scruple sprang in their minds that they could not sign a particular peace with France, their powers, as they apprehended, authorizing them only to sign a general one. Their lordships therefore sent to England to desire new powers 31, and in the meantime employed themselves with great industry between the ministers of France and those of the several allies to find some expedient for smoothing the way to an agreement among them. The Earl of Strafford went for a few days to The Hague to inform the States of Her Majesty's express commands to his colleague and himself for signing the peace as soon as possible, and to desire they would be ready at the same time, which the pensionary promised, and that their plenipotentiaries should be empowered accordingly, to the great contentment of Mons, who is now so much altered, either in reality or appearance, that he complained to the Earl of Mons, Heinsius's slowness, and charged all the delays and mismanagements of a 12-month past to that minister's account. While the Earl of Strafford stayed at The Hague, he discovered that an emissary of the Duke of Marlborough's had been there some days before, sent by his Grace to dissuade the Dutch from signing at the same time with the ministers of the Queen, which in England would at least have the appearance of a separate peace, and oblige their British friends, who knew how to turn so short a delay to very good account, as well as gratify the Emperor, on whom, it was alleged, they ought to rely much more than on Her Majesty. One of the States likewise told the Earl that the same person employed by the Duke was then in conference with the magistrates of Rotterdam, which town had declared for the continuance of the war, to assure them, if they would hold off a little, they should see an unexpected turn in the British Parliament that the Duke of Marlborough had. A list of the discontented members in both houses who were ready to turn against the court, and to crown all, that his Grace had certain intelligence of the Queen being in so ill a state of health as made it impossible for her to live above 6 weeks. So restless and indefatigable is avarice and ambition when inflamed by a desire of revenge. But representations, which had been so often tried, were now offered too late. Most of the allies, except the Emperor, were willing to put an end to the war upon Her Majesty's plan, and the further delay of 3 weeks must be chiefly imputed to that litigious manner of treating peculiar to the French, whose plenipotentiaries at Utrecht insisted with obstinacy upon many points, which at Paris Mons de Torcy had given up. The Emperor expected to keep all he already possessed in Italy. That Port Long, 32 on the Tuscan coast, should be delivered to him by France, and lastly, that he should not be obliged to renounce Spain. But the Queen, as well as France, thought that His Imperial Majesty ought to sit down contented with his partage of Naples and Milan, and to restore those territories in Italy which he had taken from the rightful proprietors, and by the possession of which he was grown dangerous to the Italian princes, by reviving antiquated claims upon them. This prince had likewise objected to Her Majesty's expedient of suffering the Elector of Bavaria to retain Luxembourg, under certain conditions, by way of security, until his electorate were restored. But the Queen, supposing that these affected delays were intended only with a view of continuing the war, resolved to defer the peace no longer on the Emperor's account. In the middle of March, 1712-13, a courier arrived at Utrecht from France, with the plan of a general peace, as it had been agreed between the Duke of Shrewsbury and Mons de Torcy, wherein every particular relating to the interests and pretensions of the several allies was brought so near to what each of them would accept, that the British plenipotentiaries hoped the peace would be general in 10 or 12 days. The Portuguese and Dutch were already prepared, and others were daily coming in, by means of their lordships' good offices, who found Mons Messenger and his colleague very stubborn to the last. Another courier was dispatched to France, upon some disputes about inserting the titles of Her Majesty and the Most Christian King, and to bring a general plan for the interests of those allies, who should not be ready against the time prefixed. The French renunciations were now arrived at Utrecht, and it was agreed that those, as well as that of the King of Spain, should be inserted at length in every treaty, by which means the whole confederacy would become guarantees of them. The courier last sent to France returned to Utrecht on the 27th of March, with the concessions of that court upon every necessary point, so that, all things being ready for putting a period to this great and difficult work, the Lord Privy Seal and the Earl of Strafford gave notice to the ministers of the several allies that their lordships had appointed Tuesday the 31st instant, wherein to sign a treaty of peace and a treaty of commerce between the Queen of Great Britain, their mistress, and the Most Christian King, and hoped the said allies would be prepared, at the same time, to follow their example. Accordingly, their lordships employed the 3 intervening days in smoothing the few difficulties that remained between the French ministers and those of the several confederate powers. The important day being now come, the Lord Bishop of Bristol and the Earl of Strafford, having assumed the character of ambassadors extraordinary 33, gave a memorial in behalf of the French Protestants to the Marechal d'Uxelles and his colleague, who were to transmit it to their court, and these delivered to the British ambassadors a declaration in writing that the pretender was actually gone out of France. The conditions of peace to be allowed the Emperor and the Empire, as adjusted between Britain and France, were now likewise delivered to the Count Zinzendorf. These and some other previous matters of smaller consequence being finished, the treaties of peace and commerce between Her Majesty of Britain and the Most Christian King were signed at the Lord Privy Seal's house between 2 and 3 of the clock in the afternoon. The ministers of the Duke of Savoy signed about an hour after. Then the assembly adjourned to the Earl of Stafford's, where they all went to dinner, and about 9 at night the peace was signed by the ministers of Portugal, by those of Prussia at 11, and when it was near midnight by the States. Thus, after all the opposition raised by a strong party in France and by a virulent faction in Britain, after all the artifices of those who presided at The Hague, and for their private interest, endeavored, in conjunction with their friends in England, to prolong the war, after the restless endeavors of the imperial court to render the treaty ineffectual, the firm, steady conduct of the Queen, the wisdom and courage of her ministry, and the abilities of those whom she employed in her negotiations abroad, prevailed to have a peace signed in one day by every power concerned, except that of the Emperor and the Empire. For his imperial majesty liked his situation too well to think of a peace, while the drudgery and expenses of the war lay upon other shoulders, and the advantages were to redound only to himself. During this whole negotiation, the King of Spain, who was not acknowledged by any of the confederates, had consequently no minister at Utrecht, but the differences between Her Majesty and that prince were easily settled by the Lord Lexington at Madrid and the Marquis of Montalion here, so that upon the Duc d'Ossuna's arrival at the Congress, some days after the peace, he was ready to conclude a treaty between the Queen and his master. Neither is it probable that the Dutch, or any other ally except the Emperor, will encounter any difficulties of moment to retard their several treaties with his Catholic Majesty. The treaties of peace and commerce between Britain and France were ratified here on the 7th of April. On the 28th, the ratifications were exchanged, and on the 5th of May, the peace was proclaimed in the usual manner, but with louder acclamations and more extraordinary rejoicings of the people than had ever been remembered on the like occasion. 34. Footnote 34. The treaty was brought to England by George St. John, Bolingbroke's young brother, who arrived with it in London on Good Friday, 3rd April, 1713. T.S. It need hardly be observed that this history is left incomplete by the author. Sir Walter Scott's note hardly agrees with Swift's own statement to Stella. Writing under date May 16, 1713, he says, "I have just finished my treatise and must be 10 days correcting it." It is evident that Swift did not intend to write a history of the 4 last years of Queen Anne's reign. A better title for this work would be the title originally given it, namely, History of the Peace of Utrecht. In the letter already quoted from Erasmus Lewis, Swift's account of the negotiations for the peace are thus remarked upon. That part of it which relates to the negotiations of peace, whether at London or at Utrecht, they admire exceedingly, and declare they never yet saw that, or any other transaction, drawn up with so much perspicuity, or in a style so entertaining and instructive to the reader in every respect. T.S.